Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. If you told me 5 years ago that having a child, something my wife and I wanted more than almost anything, would somehow become tangled up in one of the most ridiculous and petty family disputes I've ever experienced, I'd have laughed. I would have said, that's impossible. A baby brings people together. But I know better now. In our case, it wasn't the baby that caused the drama, it was a name. A name, of all things, that became the trigger for an already toxic dynamic to explode into something far more absurd than I could have imagined. Before I get into the mess itself, you need to understand a bit of the backdrop. My wife and I are both 33 now, but for the better part of our early 30s, our focus was on trying to conceive before the so-called wrong side of 35. We tried for 4 years, through all the emotional ups and downs that come with month after month of disappointment. Anyone who's gone through it knows that cycle: the cautious optimism, the waiting, the heartbreak, and then the slow climb back to trying again. It wears on you. You start to wonder if it's ever going to happen. We'd even started having those quiet, late-night conversations about what our lives might look like if it didn't. Maybe we'd travel more, maybe we'd adopt someday. But there was always a piece of us that wanted the experience of raising a child that was biologically ours. When it finally happened, it felt almost unreal. We were in the kitchen when my wife told me. I remember the way her voice shook even though she was smiling. For a moment I just stared at her, trying to process it, and then I hugged her so tightly she laughed and told me not to squish her. Those first few weeks were pure joy. Every little milestone, the first ultrasound, hearing the heartbeat, felt like a private victory. But as happy as we were, there was this other side of the family equation that was always lurking in the background, ready to complicate things. My wife's relationship with her younger half-sister, my sister-in-law, though sister is a generous term for the bond they had been strained for years. Low contact is putting it mildly. The woman was the definition of entitled, always expecting special treatment, always managing to turn every situation into something about her, and always enabled by their mother. That mother, my mother-in-law, is the kind of person you might describe as having a golden child. And my sister-in-law was it. She could do no wrong in Mill's eyes, no matter how outrageous her behavior. The jewelry box incident had sealed the deal for me in terms of not letting either of them in our home. 2 years before this whole baby name saga, they'd both tried blatantly, shamelessly, to walk out of our house with my wife's jewelry box. It wasn't just any box. It held valuable heirlooms passed down from my wife's grandmother, pieces that had both monetary and sentimental worth. We caught them in the act, and it was as awkward and infuriating as you'd imagine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just told them calmly but firmly to put it back where they found it and to leave. My wife was shaken, and from that day on, we made the decision that they weren't welcome in our home. The jewelry now lives in a safety deposit box, my idea, where no one can accidentally walk off with it again. So when the pregnancy happened and we were finally able to start talking about names, the last thing on my mind was that the toxic branch of the family would somehow get involved. I suggested the name of my Scottish grandfather, a man I'd been close to, a man whose stories had shaped my childhood and whose quiet strength had always been a kind of guiding star for me. My wife loved it immediately. It felt right, strong, classic, meaningful. We paired it with a middle name we both liked, and suddenly it was real. This wasn't just the baby anymore, he was becoming a person with a name that carried history and love. In hindsight, maybe we should have kept that decision between ourselves, but when you're excited, you want to share. We posted about it on social media, not thinking for a second that it would cause any sort of ripple. Friends congratulated us. Extended family chimed in, and then, right on cue, my sister-in-law emerged from whatever corner she'd been sulking in. Turns out she was pregnant too. Not only that, but she was months ahead of us, already well into her second trimester, and also expecting a boy. And within days of our announcement, she made one of her own. Her son's name would be the exact same as ours. First name, middle name, letter for letter. At first I thought it had to be a joke, but when my wife called her angry and incredulous, there was nothing but smugness on the other end. She told us with this infuriating little lilt in her voice that there was nothing we could do about it. And in a purely legal sense, she was right, you can't copyright a baby name. But the fact that she knew exactly what she was doing and did it anyway made it crystal clear. This was about more than a name. It was about getting under our skin. It was about drama, and she'd found the perfect way to manufacture it. I remember actually laughing at one point during that call, not because it was funny but because I could see the game she was playing. I told her point blank that while what she did was dirty and underhanded, we weren't changing our plans. We would keep our chosen name, and she could deal with it whether she wanted to go through with copying us or not. That apparently didn't sit well with her or her boyfriend. A day later he called me directly, tried to lecture me about how I was being an unreasonable dick for still wanting to use the name after she claimed it. I told him she hadn't claimed anything. If we couldn't own the name, then neither could they. He didn't like that answer. Before hanging up, he threw out a vague threat, "You'll be sorry if you don't change it," and then disconnected before I could even respond. I remember hanging up the phone, staring at it for a second, and thinking, this is going to get stupid, isn't it? After that ridiculous phone call from her boyfriend, I knew things weren't just going to blow over. People like my sister-in-law don't let go of something once they've decided it's theirs, even when it's something they only claimed out of spite. What I didn't realize at the time was just how many petty skirmishes we were going to have before either baby was even born. In the weeks after our initial argument, there was this eerie, almost strategic silence from her. No phone calls, no texts, no backhanded comments on social media. My wife and I both knew it was the calm before the storm. Sure enough, the storm came in the form of a barrage of emails. One morning my inbox had a wall of text from her that looked like she'd stayed up half the night typing it. She didn't come right out and apologize, of course not, but she did this faux reasonable thing where she suggested alternatives to our chosen name. She listed dozens of names, even ones that were vaguely similar to my grandfather, as if she was offering us some kind of helpful compromise. I sent back a short reply that basically said, "The name comes from my grandfather, that's why we're not changing it." No more, no less. She didn't like that answer and kept trying, sending follow-ups with even more names, acting like she was doing us a favor by giving us so many options. The truth was obvious. She was hoping that by overwhelming us with choices, we'd finally cave and pick something else. We ignored most of them after that. The next move came when her baby's due date got close. Out of nowhere, she called wanting us to be there for the birth. My wife told her flatly that, between the pandemic and the fact that they'd intentionally caused this drama, we weren't coming. She tried to play the emotional angle, claiming it would mean a lot to her if her only sister could be there to see her become a mom. My wife didn't even hesitate. "You stopped being my sister when you tried to take my grandmother's jewelry, and now you're pulling the same stunt with my child's name. So no." A couple weeks later, we got word through other relatives that her son had been born healthy, thankfully, and that she'd gone through with giving him my grandfather's full name. There was no way in hell she was going to change her mind at that point. She'd made the choice for the express purpose of cornering us. We didn't call, didn't send a card, didn't so much as click like on her announcement post. We just stayed quiet. But silence wasn't what she wanted. A few days later, she called us directly, demanding congratulations. I told her without a flicker of interest that we simply didn't care. She tried to push the baby name issue again, saying, "Now that my son has the name, it would be wrong for you to use it." My wife, who was on speaker, cut in. "If anyone's copying, it's you. You have no ties to this name. We do. Check the family tree if you're confused." That ended the call, but it didn't end her obsession. After that, the messages started coming from other family members. Some of them had clearly only heard her side of the story, telling us we should just pick another name to avoid drama. But the ones who knew the whole truth backed us completely. It was a 50-50 split, and I couldn't help but notice that the ones taking her side were mostly the same people who'd always made excuses for her. Then came the moment that really made me shake my head: her boyfriend's reappearance. This was months after his original threat, and I hadn't heard a word from him. Then one evening I get a knock at the door. I open it to find him standing there, clearly trying to look tough. I'm 61, gym built from years of training and 3 workouts a week. He's maybe 56, skinny, with a wispy beard that looks like it's trying to disguise a baby face. He says, "We need to talk," in that tone guys use when they're trying to sound intimidating. I just looked at him and said, "My house has cameras, get off my property and don't come back." That's it. No threats, no shouting, just a simple, direct warning. He mumbled a few obscenities as he walked away, then got into his beat-up car and sped off. Not 2 hours later, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. It was my Mill and SIL tag-teaming to yell at me for emasculating him. I told them if he didn't want to feel emasculated, maybe he shouldn't come to my house to start trouble. That shut them up for about 30 seconds, just long enough for them to switch back to their favorite subject, demanding we change our son's name while he's still young. I told them they were out of their minds to think they were still in the right after blatantly copying us. I said outright that SIL didn't even name her son out of love, she did it out of spite to hurt my wife. My wife jumped in then, telling them she was done. She laid it all out: how they treated her growing up, how entitled they both were, how the attempted jewelry theft was the moment she stopped considering SIL her sister, and how they would have no role in our lives or our child's life going forward. SIL started sobbing. Mill called me a royal bastard before hanging up. After that, we went no contact again, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be the last time we'd hear from them. When our son was born, 2 months after hers, it felt like every fight and ounce of stress from the last year just melted away the second I held him. All that mattered in that moment was that he was healthy, breathing, and staring up at me with these big, curious eyes that somehow made me feel both proud and protective in a way I'd never experienced before. My wife was exhausted but glowing, and when we told the nurse his name, the name we had always planned. There wasn't a flicker of doubt between us. We stood our ground through months of nonsense. We weren't about to fold now. For a few days after the birth, it was blissfully quiet. We were adjusting to life with a newborn, barely sleeping but happy. Then, right on cue, the peace shattered. My phone lit up with a call from my sister-in-law. Against my better judgment, I answered. The first thing I heard was screaming, not crying, actual furious screaming. She was accusing us of stealing her son's name like the last 9 months hadn't happened. I let her finish her rant and then, in as calm a voice as I could manage, reminded her of the obvious. She had no family connection to the name. We did. Anyone who looked at our family history would see the truth. That's when my wife, who was sitting next to me feeding our son, leaned over toward the phone and spoke up. You copied us first. You took a name you knew was ours that we'd shared in excitement. You've never respected me as your sister, and after what you and Mom did with my grandmother's jewelry, I decided I wanted nothing to do with you. That hasn't changed. There was a pause just long enough to imagine her face twisting up, and then the line went dead. We thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally let it go. But instead, we got weeks of what I can only call harassment. Emails, texts, Facebook messages from burner accounts. Sometimes it was her, sometimes it was my mill, sometimes it was some cousin I barely knew who'd clearly been fed a one-sided version of the story. Half the messages were demands to change the name before it's too late. The other half were guilt trips about confusing the family and hurting the boys by giving them the same name. The thing was, there was no confusion. The only person obsessed with this so-called problem was her. Our friends didn't care. The family members who mattered didn't care. The only people making a fuss were the same people who'd been making trouble for years. Then, just when we thought the noise was starting to die down, her boyfriend decided to make good on that months-old threat to make me sorry. I don't know what he was expecting when he showed up at my door. Maybe a fight, maybe to intimidate me into backing down, but he was clearly in over his head. He barely made it up the walkway before I stepped outside and told him to leave. I didn't raise my voice, didn't move toward him, didn't even take my hands out of my pockets. I just looked him in the eye and said, "My house has cameras. You need to get off my property and never come back." He tried to save face with a few shouted insults as he backed away, but it was obvious he'd lost whatever nerve he'd come with. 10 minutes later, my phone rang, unfamiliar number again. Mill and SIL back in stereo, calling to accuse me of emasculating him. I told them plainly, if he didn't want to feel emasculated, he shouldn't have shown up here to start trouble. Then I hung up. After that, they tried one last push to get us to change our son's name. He's so young, Mill said. There's still time. I told her there was no universe in which we'd hand them that kind of victory, especially after how this all started. I even said outright that SIL hadn't named her son out of love. She'd done it purely to spite my wife. That got another screaming fit on the other end, which my wife cut short by telling them she was done with both of them for good. We went no contact again after that, and this time I figured it might stick. I was wrong. Months later, out of the blue, my sister-in-law called. Her tone was bitter, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Well, you won." I didn't even know what she meant until she explained. She and her boyfriend had gotten into a huge fight. Apparently he'd been stewing for months about the fact that she'd never let him choose any part of their son's name. He wanted to name his boy after someone from his own family, and the fight had gotten so bad he finally walked out. She told me she'd caved, and they'd reissued her son's birth certificate with a completely different name. According to her, the whole process cost her around $500. Then she actually had the audacity to demand we compensate her for it, plus another $100 for her emotional damage from having to get used to calling her kid by a new name. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Then I told her this would never have happened if you hadn't stolen our name in the first place. We don't owe you a cent. My wife, sitting beside me, shook her head and added, "And we never will." That was the last time we spoke. We cut contact completely after that. My father-in-law, who's divorced from Mill for reasons that are crystal clear to anyone who meets her, still visits often and absolutely adores his grandson. From him and a few other relatives, we've heard that things between SIL and her ex are a mess, but honestly, that's not our problem. Not our monkeys, not our circus. Going fully no contact with my sister-in-law and mother-in-law felt like taking a deep breath after holding it for way too long. There was no more bracing myself every time my phone buzzed. No more wondering what backhanded comment or passive-aggressive message was going to land in my inbox that day. The house felt quieter, lighter, even though they'd never actually set foot in it since the jewelry box incident. It's amazing how much mental space two toxic people can occupy even from a distance, and how freeing it is when you finally slam that door shut for good. Of course, for good is relative when you've still got extended family in the mix. My father-in-law, who I honestly have a lot of respect for, never tried to pressure us to make peace. He'd been divorced from my Mill for years, and you could tell just by talking to him for 5 minutes that he'd seen every shade of her entitlement firsthand. The man was a saint for putting up with her as long as he did. Since all of this, his visits became more frequent. He'd come by to see his grandson, bringing little toys or just sitting with the baby on his lap while telling us stories about my wife's childhood. Those visits felt like the family connection we actually wanted, easy, genuine, and without a hidden agenda. But even with him around, there were occasional ripples. A cousin might accidentally let slip that my SIL had been venting about us at some family gathering. Another relative might text something vague like, "It's such a shame the boys won't grow up close," as if the situation was some big mystery instead of a direct consequence of her own choices. Every time that happened, my wife and I stayed on the same page. We weren't engaging. We weren't reopening wounds just so they could throw salt in them. And the truth is, the satisfaction of having stood our ground made it easier to brush off those little jabs. We'd been tested, baited, and outright threatened over something as personal as nomming our child, and we hadn't budged. There's a quiet kind of pride in that, not the gloating kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you didn't let someone else rewrite your story. Our son would grow up with the name we chose for him because it mattered to us, because it was tied to family and love, not spite or one-upmanship. Every now and then, I'd think about that phone call where she admitted she'd changed her kid's name. I'd picture her sitting in some government office, filling out forms, swiping her card for the $500 fee, all while stewing about how we made her do it. It was poetic in its own way, the mess she created circling right back to her. And the kicker, even after spending all that money, she still couldn't undo the fact that she'd been the one to copy us first. That's the part she'll never be able to change. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The baby grew, we found our footing as parents, and the drama faded into the background noise of old grudges. Sure, there's still a chance she'll try to stir something up down the line. People like her rarely stay quiet forever, but we've learned how to shut it down before it starts. Now if her name pops up on my phone, I don't even have to think about it. Block, delete, move on. And honestly, that's been the biggest shift of all, realizing that I don't owe anyone my time, my energy, or my peace. Not her, not her mother, not anyone who thinks they get to dictate how we live our lives or raise our son. We've built a little bubble here, just the three of us, and it's stronger without them in it. If they want to keep telling their version of the story, fine, let them. The people who matter know the truth, and the rest, they're free to believe whatever makes them feel better. It doesn't change the fact that, in the end, we didn't just keep the name, we kept our boundaries too. And that's worth more than anything they ever tried to take from us. No contact doesn't mean no noise. That was one of the first lessons we learned after cutting my sister-in-law and mother-in-law off entirely. You can slam the front door shut, lock every bolt, and throw away the key, but gossip has a way of slipping in through the cracks, especially in a family where certain people thrive on stirring the pot. At first, it was subtle. A relative we hadn't spoken to in months would suddenly check in with a text. The conversation would start casual, asking how the baby was sleeping, whether my wife was back to work yet, but then it would drift. "I heard there's been some tension," they'd say, fishing for details without ever naming names, or they'd phrase it like concern. "It's just a shame your boys won't grow up close. You know, it's not too late to make amends." Every time, I'd shut it down politely but firmly. "We're happy the baby's happy, and we're not discussing that situation." Most people would back off, at least outwardly, but you could tell they'd be running back to report exactly what we'd said. That was fine. If they were going to repeat our words, I made sure to give them nothing they could twist. Sometimes, though, it wasn't even fishing, it was bait. One of my wife's cousins, who's always been thick as thieves with my SIL, left a public comment on one of our Facebook photos. "He's so cute, what's his name again? I keep getting confused." It was transparent, and I didn't bother replying. My wife rolled her eyes and deleted it. We didn't need to play their games to know what they were trying to do. The most blatant attempt came a few months after the name change debacle. We got an invitation to a big extended family barbecue at an aunt's house. The invite came from the aunt herself, who I actually like, so we considered going until we learned through my father-in-law that my mill and SIL would be there. Not just might be there, they were planning to use the barbecue as an opportunity to clear the air. Translation: corner us in front of as many people as possible and try to put us on the defensive. We politely declined the invite, saying the baby's nap schedule made it tricky to attend events right now. That was partly true, but even if the baby had been sleeping like a dream, we wouldn't have gone. I know how those situations go. They'd start with fake smiles, turn on the waterworks for sympathy, and then try to rewrite history until we were the bad guys for refusing to move on. We'd already moved on. They just didn't like where we'd moved to. Every so often, my father-in-law would give us little updates, not to stir things up, but just so we weren't blindsided if something spilled over into our lives. He told us how my SIL still complained to anyone who'd listen about the trauma of changing her son's name, how she framed it as us bullying her into it, conveniently skipping the part where she stole our chosen name in the first place. She even claimed we owed her emotional damages. which I guess made her feel better about blowing $500 to undo her own petty stunt. Through it all, my wife and I kept our line in the sand. No contact meant no contact. We didn't respond to jabs, we didn't send messages through third parties, and we definitely didn't let anyone convince us to just sit down and talk it out. You can't talk things out with people who think every conversation is a battlefield where they're entitled to win. If there's one thing the grapevine is good for, it's showing you who's really on your side. The ones who respected our boundaries stopped bringing up my SIL and mill altogether. The ones who did, they made it easy to decide who to keep at arm's length. It was like pruning a tree, cut off the dead, tangled branches, and the rest grows healthier. By then, we weren't just protecting ourselves from two toxic people. We were protecting the peace we'd built for our son, and every time we ignored another attempt to drag us back into the circus, that peace got a little stronger. When our son was born, everything in my life shifted. There's a before and after to parenthood that no one can truly prepare you for. The moment you hold your child, suddenly the stakes are higher than they've ever been. The petty squabbles, the toxic relatives, the childish drama, they all fade into background noise. Your mind zeroes in on one thing, keeping that little human safe, happy, and untainted by the nonsense. And in our case, nonsense had a first and last name, two of them actually, my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law. Before becoming parents, it was easier to get pulled into arguments, to feel like we had to defend ourselves or to waste energy responding to jabs. But once our son arrived, it wasn't just about us anymore. Every bit of energy we gave to fighting with them was energy we took away from him, and that realization hardened our resolve in a way nothing else could have. I remember one quiet night, a week after we brought him home. He was asleep in his bassinet and my wife and I were sitting on the couch just watching him breathe. It hit me right then, the kind of people we keep in our lives will shape the environment he grows up in. If we allowed toxic family members access to him, people who manipulate, steal, and throw tantrums when they don't get their way, we'd be telling him that's normal. That it's okay to accept mistreatment from people just because they're family. No, absolutely not. So we made a pact right there on that couch. From now on, our son's world would be a fortress. Inside it, only people who brought love, respect, and stability would be allowed. Everyone else could stay outside the gates, no matter their blood relation. That meant no half measures with my SIL or mill, no just this once visits, no letting them meet him for the sake of appearances, no photo ops, no phone calls, no casual drop-ins. We stuck to it even when it got awkward. My FIL, who's nothing like his ex-wife, respected it completely. He came over often, played with his grandson, and never tried to smuggle in news from the other side. But other relatives, the ones who still talked to my SIL and mill, would sometimes pressure us. It's such a shame your son won't know his aunt. One day he'll ask why he's not close to his grandma. Our answer was always the same: he'll know the truth when he's old enough to understand it, and he'll thank us for keeping the poison out of his life. The name drama became a kind of parable for us, a perfect example of what we didn't want him exposed to. Think about it. Instead of celebrating our pregnancy, my SIL tried to turn it into a competition. She saw something meaningful to us and tried to take it for herself just to score points. And when that backfired, she demanded compensation for the mess she'd created. If that's how she behaves over a name, what would she do with influence over a child? I shudder to think about it. We also took steps to make our fortress literal. Our home became a sanctuary, security cameras at the front door, locks upgraded, a clear no unannounced visitors policy, and with the pandemic still lingering, we had the perfect built-in excuse to limit access even further without raising eyebrows. There's a strange kind of power that comes from saying no without flinching. At first, the refusals were hard, especially for my wife, who was used to being guilt-tripped into submission. But each time we held firm, it got easier. And each time we shut down a new attempt to breach our boundaries, it reinforced the walls of that fortress around our family. Our son will grow up knowing his parents protected him not just from strangers, but from people who happened to share a family tree yet showed no respect for what family is supposed to mean. And someday, when he's old enough to hear the story, he'll know that even before he could speak, we made choices to shield him from selfishness and entitlement. Because love isn't just hugs and lullabies, sometimes it's a locked door and a very firm no. It didn't take long for the cracks to show on my sister-in-law's side of the fence. Honestly, I could have predicted it. You don't build a relationship or a family on spite and expect it to hold. But I'll admit, even I was surprised at how quickly everything unraveled after she and her boyfriend, sorry, baby daddy, started turning on each other. The first sign was a text from my father-in-law. Just one line: "Things are getting ugly over there." That was enough to make me raise an eyebrow, but not enough to make me care. I didn't ask for details, and I certainly didn't go digging. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some people's drama is like quicksand. The more you step in to understand, the more you get pulled down, and we'd already spent more than enough emotional bandwidth on them. But the updates kept coming whether we wanted them or not. Family members would drop little bombs into conversations, always with that tone that implied they were trying not to gossip, which, of course, meant they were absolutely trying to gossip. Apparently, he's been bringing up the name again. She says he's embarrassed to introduce their son because of it. He wanted the boy named after his side of the family all along. I'll be honest, I laughed. Not in a smug, we won kind of way, okay, maybe a little smug, but more into this is exactly what happens when you play stupid games kind of way. She stolen our chosen name just to get under our skin, ignoring the fact that it had zero meaning to her, and now the man she had a child with was using that very fact as ammo against her. It was like watching someone build a house out of wet cardboard and then acting shocked when it collapsed in the rain. The tipping point came when my SIL called us out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in months, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered on speaker so my wife could hear. Her voice was brittle, the kind of tone people get when they've been swallowing their pride for too long and finally choke on it. "You win," she said flatly. I didn't even know what to say at first because it was so out of character for her to admit defeat in anything. Then she launched into the story. She and her baby daddy had been fighting for weeks, and the name had been at the center of it. He hated that their son wasn't named after anyone on his side of the family. He hated explaining the origin to people because it always came back to me and my wife. And finally, he told her he was done with the bullshit and wanted the name changed officially. She resisted at first, of course, but resistance isn't easy when you're already knee-deep in relationship problems, and apparently this fight was the one that tipped everything over. She caved. The birth certificate was reissued, the boy given a completely new name, and the process set her back about $500. At least, that's what she claimed. I'd bet good money she padded that number a little to make herself sound more like a victim. Then came the kicker: she wanted us to reimburse her. Not just for the $500, but for an additional $100 for what she called emotional damage from having to retrain herself to use a new name. I think my laugh actually startled her. It wasn't mean-spirited so much as pure disbelief. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You hijack a name that has meaning to us, use it out of spite, then have to change it because your own partner hates it and you think we should pay for your bad decision." She sputtered something about fairness, about how we could afford it and it would be the mature thing to do. I told her flat out that the mature thing would have been to respect our choice in the first place. My wife chimed in then, her voice calm but with that steel edge I've come to admire so much in her. "This entire situation was manufactured by you. We owe you nothing, and the only emotional damage here is what you've done to yourself." SIL didn't take that well. She went from brittle to full-on screaming in seconds, the kind of shrill, angry noise that makes you instinctively want to hold the phone at arm's length. But before she could finish her tirade, my wife cut her off with 4 words that ended the call. "We're done here, goodbye." And that was it. No follow-up texts, no fake apologies, just silence, and for us, peace. The beauty of it all, we didn't have to lift a finger to make her implode. She did it entirely on her own. And I'll tell you, there's something deeply satisfying about watching a toxic person's schemes crumble without you ever stepping in to push. After that last phone call, something in the air changed. It wasn't just relief, though there was plenty of that, it was finality. Like we'd closed a heavy iron gate on a property that had been causing nothing but trouble for years, and we'd finally turned the key. My wife and I didn't even have to discuss it, we both knew what we wanted. No more olive branches, no more half-hearted maybe one day conversations. We were done permanently. We'd been down the road of temporary no contact before, after the jewelry box incident, after the baby name theft, after the front door screaming matches. Every time we'd end up giving them just enough rope to hang themselves again. This time, the rope was gone entirely. We unfollowed and blocked them on every platform, social media, messaging apps, email, all of it. Not a mute, not a let's just hide their posts kind of thing. Full-on digital witness protection mode. My wife even went into her phone and renamed both her mother's and her sister's numbers to Do Not Answer MIL and Do Not Answer SIL before blocking them. She said it made her feel better to label them for exactly what they were, people who should never have direct access to our lives again. And honestly, it wasn't hard to follow through. We weren't missing anything. The people who actually cared about us respected our boundaries. The rest, they'd been nothing but noise. That's where my father-in-law came in. If my mother-in-law was the master manipulator and my sister-in-law the entitled accomplice, then my father-in-law was the exact opposite, grounded, respectful, and quietly protective of his daughter. He'd divorced Mill long ago for reasons that were now glaringly obvious, and he'd built a life that didn't revolve around drama. When he came by for visits, it was always about his grandson first. He never tried to slide in questions about making peace or giving them another chance. He knew better. One evening, he stopped by with a small wooden rattle he'd carved himself. It was smooth, sanded down perfectly with our son's initials etched into the handle. When my wife asked him why he'd gone to the trouble, he just shrugged and said, "Figured I'd make him something nobody could steal." We all laughed because in that moment it felt like more than a joke. It was a reminder that we were building something real here, a family where the people in it actually wanted to protect each other instead of tear each other down. Word still trickled in about my sister-in-law, mostly from my father-in-law or cousins who couldn't help but share. Apparently, she and her baby daddy were now in a constant on-again off-again cycle. He'd leave, she'd rage about it, they'd get back together, and the whole thing would repeat. There were whispers about money problems, about her regretting the name change because it didn't feel right, about her blaming everyone else for her situation. But that was the beauty of it, we didn't have to care anymore. Not our problem. Not our circus. Not our monkeys. The funny thing about going no contact is that at first it feels like you're giving something up, like you're cutting off a limb. But once you settle into it, you realize the limb was just a parasite attached to you, sucking away your energy. The moment it's gone, you feel lighter, healthier, you start breathing deeper without even noticing. We filled that space with better things: park trips with our son, late-night talks over coffee after he was asleep, weekends spent visiting friends who didn't come with a constant undercurrent of tension. Even something as simple as planning his first birthday felt like a joy instead of a looming question of who's going to try to ruin it. And the more we lived like this, the more obvious it became we should have closed that gate years ago. But maybe we needed all those ugly incidents, the jewelry theft attempt, the baby name nonsense, the driveway confrontation, to really understand that. Because once the gate was locked and we walked away, we never looked back. Going no contact isn't like flipping a light switch and walking away into permanent peace. It's more like locking the door to your house, then hearing occasional knocks, scratching, or even someone shouting through the door every now and then trying to get in. The first few weeks after we cut my Mill and SIL off for good, it was blissfully quiet. Too quiet, in fact. My wife even joked one night, either they've finally gotten the hint or they're building up for something big. I told her not to give them ideas. Sure enough, little aftershocks started popping up. The first one came in the form of a mutual acquaintance, someone who wasn't exactly a close friend but had been around the family enough to have everyone's numbers. She called my wife just to catch up, but within 5 minutes the real reason for her call came out. Apparently, my SIL had been going around telling her version of events to anyone who would listen. In her version, we were the unhinged ones who stole her baby name out of spite, cut her off for no reason, and were keeping her nephew away from her out of sheer cruelty. Conveniently missing from her story were the parts about stealing my wife's grandmother's jewelry, copying our chosen name out of pettiness, and trying to intimidate us into changing it. When the acquaintance asked if we wanted to set the record straight, I laughed and told her no. Because here's the thing, anyone who actually knows us already knows the truth, and anyone who believes my SIL's side without question, well, they're not the kind of people whose opinion matters to me. The second aftershock came about a month later when an unfamiliar number popped up on my phone. I almost ignored it, but I answered out of habit. It was my SIL. She didn't even say hello. Her first words were, "I just want you to know you ruined my life." I could hear the anger in her voice, but there was something else too, that kind of strained edge people get when they're both furious and desperate. She went on to tell me her baby daddy had left again, this time for good, and she was struggling to make ends meet. Then came the kicker. She said that since we'd won the baby name war, we should at least help her out financially because we'd taken away her dignity. I actually had to pull the phone away from my ear and look at it for a second. Then I laughed out loud. I told her she was out of her mind if she thought she could burn every bridge and then come running across it for help. She tried to say that I was being cold and holding a grudge. I told her no, I wasn't holding a grudge, I was enforcing a boundary, and there's a difference. She hung up on me. The third aftershock was more subtle. It came when my wife sat down one evening, sighed, and admitted something she'd been carrying for a long time. She said, "You know, I always wanted to believe my mom and my sister could change, even after everything. But now I realize I was just keeping that door open because I was scared to admit they never really loved me in the way I needed." It hit me hard because I knew she was right. Her mother had always treated her like the less important child. Her sister had always gotten away with things she would have been punished for. The baby name fiasco was just the final nail in a coffin that had been building for decades. We talked for hours that night about the kind of family we wanted to be for our son, about breaking those cycles, about making sure he never had to wonder if he was loved or valued. And by the end of it, my wife said something that made me realize just how far she'd come. They can knock on that gate all they want, but they'll never get back in, and that's okay. Even now, every once in a while, there's another ripple. A random blocked number trying to call. A weirdly worded comment on a social media post from an account with no profile picture. A distant cousin just checking in with suspicious timing. But they're smaller each time. We don't react. We don't get pulled into the drama. We just live. And that's when it really sinks in, the aftershocks only have power if you stop and listen for them. We've learned to let them fade into the background noise while we keep building the life we actually want. It's strange how quickly the absence of chaos starts to feel like a gift you've always had but never unwrapped. At first, when we went no contact with my mill and SIL, it felt almost loud in its own way, like the silence had weight to it. My wife and I would catch ourselves waiting for the next shoe to drop, a phone call, a letter, someone showing up at the door. But weeks turned into months, and that waiting faded. We adjusted to the quiet. Then we started to enjoy it. The biggest change was in our home. There was no more tension hanging in the air, no more unspoken what if they scenarios to distract us from our own lives. We could sit in the living room with our son between us, his tiny hands grabbing at his toys, and not once did I have to think about who might try to insert themselves into our family moment. Our son, of course, had no idea about the storms that came before he was born. And that's exactly how it should be. He'll grow up knowing love without conditions, boundaries without guilt, and security without the threat of it being snatched away because someone feels entitled to it. My wife blossomed in ways I didn't expect. Without the constant push-pull of her mother's and sister's drama, she seemed lighter. She smiled more, laughed more, slept better. Even her voice changed, the hesitation she'd once had when talking about her family was gone. She spoke about our future like it was ours to shape, not something we'd have to negotiate around other people's selfishness. She still has moments, of course. Sometimes she'll hear about someone's close, healthy relationship with their mom or sister, and I'll see that flicker of longing. But it passes quickly now, replaced by a steadiness I admire. She doesn't pretend she had what others had, but she's making sure our son will. Every now and then, my father-in-law stops by. He loves his grandson with a genuine warmth that only comes from someone who's had to fight for his place in a child's life. He doesn't mention my mill or SIL unless we bring them up, and even then it's only to confirm that yes, we made the right decision. He's been divorced from my mill for years, and now I see why he'd been living with the same toxicity we cut out. He told me once while holding his grandson, the best thing you can give him is the family you choose, not just the one you were born with. I think about that a lot. Social media made it easier than ever to keep tabs if we wanted to, but we don't. We muted, blocked, and deleted where we could. If someone tries to update us on my mill or SIL, we cut the conversation short, not out of pettiness but because our lives no longer have room for their chaos. And over time, something amazing happened. We stopped thinking about them entirely. It's not that they don't exist, it's that they simply don't take up space in our minds anymore. There's no anger, no lingering bitterness, just nothing. They're irrelevant. I used to think cutting family off would feel like losing a limb, but it's more like having a tumor removed. At first, you feel the ache where it used to be, you keep noticing the absence. But then your body heals, your strength returns, and you realize you're healthier without it. That's where we are now. Our son's name, my grandfather's name, is spoken in our home every day with love and pride. It belongs to him just as it was meant to. And every time I say it, I'm reminded not of the petty fight it caused, but of the family history and the good man it came from. We built this peace. We chose it. And we're not giving it up for anyone. Now the silence isn't heavy anymore. It's light. It's freedom. It's the sound of a life that belongs to us and no one else.